Welcome back. This is Full Frontal Philosophy. I'm your host, Aaron Green. We are talking about talking, still talking about talking. And the last few episodes we've done Platonism and realism, scientific realism or just realism. And I think now we'll go on to the sort of most common general way of looking at how we communicate and how information becomes sort of a message or meaningful, or how it's possible to communicate. So I think when you ask someone, how do words get meaning? Most people would just say by agreement, by common usage, right? We use words so they work. And this idea that words have meaning because we agree on what they mean is generally called nominalism, or social construction of language. Sort of from the encyclopedia, we get the meaning, the view that meaning is essentially communal use. Linguistic meanings are social processes. No matter what mathematics books say, no matter what dictionaries say, no matter what are the private and therefore diverse neural associations that are correlated with the linguistic expressions in speakers' brains at different times, the place where conventional meaning of linguistic expressions essentially resides is in the actual communicative use that speakers make of them. Now, how you say that the meaning is in the use is a little bit circular again. So I think one of the most prominent advocates for this view that meaning is functionally just, or it is essentially just functional and communal and by agreement. Quine says there is some standard of intelligibility or clarity that provides a reason for accepting nominalism, for acceptance. So there is a standard of somewhere, just a standard of communicability, and that this standard is ultimate in that it cannot be reduced to other kinds of considerations such as mere convenience. So the idea here is that the communal use of a word or of language in general is sufficient when it gets to a certain standard. Where that standard is still unclear and never gets clarified. But the idea is that there's a place where you can get to with language where you have standard and fundamental or basic communicability. So the ultimate basis for nominalism and social communication in general is simply the fact that words work for communicating ideas both clearly and intelligibly, and in fact continue to work without any appeal to Platonism or Platonic ideals or scientific data. So it doesn't matter what the scientific basis for the meaning is. It doesn't matter whether you've investigated it. So long as everybody is able, and again, it's a very, this part gets unclear, is where is that line where something goes from being a personal usage to being a communicable use. So one way to kind of explain this is when you see a red house, it's plain common sense that we can say a house is red and be understood as saying the house is red because red is the categorical identity we have given to the color of the house. A universal category of redness is not necessary for the term red to be deployed effectively in a conversation. So then the question is, well, why do we care? So as long as it works, why would we care what the category, whether the category really exists or only exists as a convention. And going back to Quine's point that it's somehow more than just a convenience, that the words work in a kind of fundamental way, and we do have the capacity to communicate. So this raises an issue. So as long as everyone is trying to communicate truthfully, as long as everyone does agree or tries to agree, we can see how there could be a standard of communicability that works across the board, or at least functionally. But what happens if not everyone agrees? Like, what if we don't agree with each other? And what is the definition of an us, a group? Like, who's valid? Who validates the idea that this is the standard? Obviously, Quine is relatively comfortable in his social position, and he's able to say that this is, that the language works the way it's supposed to work. But he's in a position to do that because he's not anxious. He doesn't have an anxiety about the words he uses meaning something else. And there are a lot of examples of people using the idea of universality to negate other people's existence. I think if we go back to Margaret Thatcher's famous quote that there's no such thing as society. There's only individual men and women and families. Now you can see the appeal of that for conservatives, which is that then there's no need to provide support, financial, political, or legal, for social organization, social programs, social housing, anything social. You can just ignore it because the society doesn't exist. It's sort of every man for himself, and families, you get what you were given. Now the fact that lots of families don't exist anymore, like lots of families, most people are abused by family members, whether it's physically or sexually. This doesn't come up. And what do you do when a family doesn't work? Who's making then this notion of family? Who decides what a family is if there's no society around it to give it this notion of universality or intelligibility to communicate? So you can see how it's an easy cop-out for politics, but in terms of practical application, the Prime Minister of the British people saying that British society doesn't exist, it gives you very little basis for any kind of communication or even stability within anywhere. But again, it's the sort of thing you can say and you can get away with saying within a certain context. I think another interesting example was that when the Nazi physicists were taken to the UK, to England, and they were monitored after the war, and the MI6, the people monitoring them were surprised that they had no qualms about working for Hitler. They just didn't think that the bomb was possible. And it's that social isolation where any given group can be isolated from the implications of the greater society, because they can ignore what is inconvenient for them. And there is this question then, like, how does the agreement become binding? How does it become universal? If it's only by agreement, who gets to agree? And then what we'll get to later is, what would you use? If language only exists by agreement, what would you use to form the agreement? Because you need to then agree on the language you use to form the agreement, to agree on the language you use in general. And then you would need to agree on the language for the language of agreement, and so on and so forth. And it's a never-ending, it's an infinite recursion of agreement that never gets to any kind of bottom. And I think that kind of comes out when we look at the motivation that Quine had when he sort of proposed nominalism as a fundamental basis for communication, which was that what seems to be the most natural principle for abstracting classes or properties, i.e. set theory, leads to paradoxes. Escape from these paradoxes can apparently be effected only by recourse to alternative rules whose artificiality and arbitrariness arouse suspicion that we are lost in a world of make-believe. So we see here that Quine is willing to make believe that there is a universal social agreement, or at least sufficiently standard usage of language, but that it's only that make-believe is worth it to avoid another set of make-believes that emerges if we don't accept or if we demand a more fundamental foundation for information, or in his case mathematics, but any kind of information will have this problem. So what we see is we can only ever create more paradoxes by searching for a language that is fundamental to and underpins language. So I think we'll leave it there for today and come back with a kind of look at the paradox of using information or using language to describe language, and all of the deep implications of talking about talking using any kind of language. Good day.